Welcome to Season 2, Episode 7, Chronicles of UK Salafism, an Insider Perspective. This particular episode shall focus on the year 2006 and what transpired throughout. However, before doing that, I will do the usual recap on some of the events in 2005, which I may have omitted previously. And I will start with my commencement in October 2005 of my PhD studies. And the reason why I decided to embark upon these studies is because following the events of 9/11, Salafis and our communities had a number of researchers who wanted to interview us, and it was almost sensationalist for them to speak with individuals who knew extremists or were former extremists, and we felt like guinea pigs to an extent. And so I decided that it would be more effective, it would be more academic to review our own reality as an insider. Hence my embarking upon the PhD studies, and I will discuss aspects of that as we proceed through this particular series, this season of the Chronicles. The 23rd of July of 2005, there was another significant terrorist event that didn't get as much airwaves as some of the others, like 7/7, the Madrid bombings before that, and 9/11. And this was where 3 bombs killed 88 people in Namar Bay in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And this is a continuing trend that is noticeable in that when terrorist attacks take place in either Africa, Asia, non-developing countries as such, they do not get much media coverage or attention. However, when it's the Western world, the media coverage is saturated, and sadly we see other regions of the world pay equal focus to terrorist attacks in the West. Another event that did receive significant coverage, but arguably not significant enough by the powers that be at the time, the American government, the president of the US at the time, and that was on the 23rd of August with Hurricane Katrina, in which 1,836 people died and $115 billion of damage was caused. And the political fallout from that was resounding due to the neglect. And one stark observation that many saw was that President Bush at the time did not even set foot in the state, but instead circled around in a helicopter surveying the damage. He didn't meet US citizens, he did not meet those who'd been displaced, those who had suffered casualties, their family casualties, and the racial undertones surrounding this entire disaster have been written about and discussed even up until today. But I'd like to bring that to a more local socio-cultural backdrop as it affects converts, black Muslim converts in the UK. And it was noticeable among my particular community that there was not much attention paid to Hurricane Katrina. And this was symptomatic of something else, since many of us embraced Islam. And that was an understanding, or a tacit understanding, to not bring anything culturally or based on ethnicity to the fore as it related to African Caribbean individuals, converts in particular. However, when we looked at our South Asian counterparts, Arab counterparts, we saw that there was no such requirement, there was no such psychological contract, for want of a better phrase, in that They did fundraising. They lamented when there were natural disasters, like in Pakistan, as I'd mentioned in the previous episode, where Luton galvanized their community and there was fundraising up and down the country. But when it referred to black ethnicities, there was very little attention paid within the wider Muslim community and the Salafi Muslim communities as well. And that continues to an extent up until today. Continuing with other significant events that I admitted due to the length of the previous episode, the final one I would mention is on the 8th of November 2005, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was the first woman to lead an African country as president of Liberia. And that's where I will conclude on the 2005 summary of areas that I did not speak of. In further prelude to 2006, I want to make an observation regarding leadership amongst the Muslim community more generally and the Salafi communities more specifically. And the listener may have discerned throughout the previous season and this one that there were problems surfacing around leadership amongst many of the Salafis up and down the country, whether it's regionally or nationally, so to speak. Now, I have looked at 3 possible reasons for this. And again, just like these podcasts, this is subjective, but I'm looking at it from an evidence-based perspective. And these reasons were as follows. 1, there were those who were unfit to lead due to being unqualified or inexperienced. The second reason I observed was those who were and continue to be desirous of power and control. And that's very clear. The third one is what is a reality that remains today, specifically amongst Salafi communities, that there's been a lack of comprehensive support for any identifiable leader or leadership framework. And I'm not including elements or fringe elements like the cult that I've spoken of throughout these episodes. I'm talking about national leadership that is recognized and supported despite efforts to consolidate and support that with students of knowledge coming back from Medina, for example, those who have been given endorsement and are academically astute within their communities, religiously or secular. And we have not seen such a consolidated leadership amongst the Salafi movement since the days of Jimas, where Abu Muntazir was, I would say, a small U, undisputed leader of the community, of the Salafi community via Jimas. We have not seen such consolidated leadership since that time. I have to reiterate that. Now, issues as to why, or factors as to why that may occur, is that you'll see, unlike corporate professional environments, charitable causes can have anyone, a dedicated volunteer, a committed foot soldier, just by their presence and their input and willingness to work, rise to positions of authority. He's a good brother. She's a dedicated sister. Whether they have leadership qualities, managerial qualities, qualifications, or the like is not the issue. It's not a requirement. It's not a factor. However, when you've seen charities approached and employed or utilized the skills of qualified volunteers, experienced volunteers, and they've adhered to protocols akin to that of corporate industry, then you see progress within those charities. And I believe that the Salafi communities and the lack of leadership therein is due to that inexperience, due to the reasons I've just mentioned, with the exception of a few characters who are then challenged because the refusal to recognize them as leaders is what plagues that particular organisation. So much so that with Brixton, up until 9/11, up until the noughties, I would say as well, we were a very unified group of Salafis. The smaller disputes were managed, but we were a very tight group, many of us having come to the religion together and then joining with other young elements within the community whose views and understanding of the religion and commitment to evoke change were the same. But those differences and fissures, as I've mentioned previously, began to increase post 9/11 and 7/7. To such an extent that even in 2004, when after being in Saudi Arabia for 2 years, I decided I would step back because I was given assurances that there were those who were ready to take the helm and run the community, and I didn't need to be in charge, being 3,500 miles away. And I did that. I stepped back, but I gave a caveat that I would return if there were serious problems brewing, which actually started happening, and the phone calls and complaints that I received with evidence of what was happening, lack of management, lack of leadership, and ineptitude that almost paralyzed the community. And this is arguably speaking, this is a perspective that I am coming from. Those who disagree would counter my narrative, and obviously they are welcome to do so. So this return of mine, after just a few months, I returned to the UK, ousted those who were in so-called management positions after investigating, researching what was happening from community members and other mosque management leaders, and reinstituted other positions and new individuals as well, and the general manager position to make things start working more effectively administratively and operationally. Sadly, up until today, that caused I think definitive fractures between old friendships that predated embracing Islam. I think it's apt to refer to the ignorance or failure to understand the difference between leadership and management. And I want to refer to a verse in the Quran, the English rendition being, and consult them in the affairs. Then when you have taken a decision, put your trust in Allah. Certainly Allah loves those who put their trust in him. That was Surah Ali Imran, the third surah, ayat 159. And the explanation of that verse, in part, from the Tafsir Ahsanul Bayan, page 382 of volume 1, says here, from this we infer that even after consultation, the right to the final decision rests with the ruler, in this instance, leader, not with those with whom he consults, nor the majority of them. Close quote. Herein lay the issue in the tenure of my direct leadership of the mosque up until 2009 with colleagues. Whereas in the 90s, there was consultation, but there was support in decisions that had been made. But when the dispute started arising without any counter or any alternative solution to some of the issues that were being presented, as leader, I took it upon myself to make decisions. I'll give examples from the 90s. Purchasing the mosque and the premises and receiving finances from a charity that was given those finances without any strings attached. That was one incident. The opportunity to purchase the building next door for Iqra School as it was developing. And again, the same elements in management and administration, being reluctant to preside and agree on that taking place. There was a very immature understanding that is prevalent still amongst Salafis at the earlier stages of development, according to my cognitive development framework, in which you cannot take any funds unless it's from fellow Salafis. And there's a contradiction here for the simple reason that argument does not extend to their personal income and earnings, because some receive state benefits and they have no issue with this. However, when it comes to charitable work, no funds are acceptable from any non-Salafi entity. And I think that the listener will agree with my observation that this is farcical, to say the least. Another example is, and I will elaborate upon this when I go through this particular podcast, regarding the inactivity and inability to make decisions proactively, is when the media converged outside the mosque after 7/7, and management and administration. At the time I was in Saudi Arabia, the press officer was in Leighton, as I mentioned in the previous episode. The management administration remained behind closed doors in the mosque, looking out of the window as MPs, councillor leaders and other mosque leaders came outside of the mosque and defended Brixton Mosque. So, without further ado, I will start upon the year 2006, and I hope the listener didn't mind me indulging in this prelude to the year. And in 2006, the mosque structure was as follows. I think it's important to highlight the management structure following what I've just said. And there was myself as a trustee, chairman. There was Jamal Boichi and Samir Koomson, who were considered trustees at that particular time. They are trustees of the Iqra Independent School. However, present disputes and legal proceedings question whether they were legitimately elected during that period of time in 2006 and around that era. Another legitimate trustee at that time, up until quite recently, was Abdurrahman Anderson, and our elder, Sheikh Kamaluddin. The Shura, the management committee, comprised Omar Jamaiki, Imam Omar, Ibrahim Walker, who was the operations manager, that new position that had been formed shortly before, Abdul Malik Edwards, finance manager, Abdulaziz Henry, youth manager, Mohammed Sidi, community manager, Abdullah McHugh, communications manager, Suleiman Amankwa, rahimahullah, fundraising manager, and there was a vacant position for property maintenance manager. The press and public relations was Abdul Haqq Kufi, Ashanti, and sisters issues were dealt with by a group, Al-Akhawat, and there was an email address provided to them for contact. And at the beginning of January, I was scheduled to travel from Jeddah to the UK, and I have an itinerary here which I'd like to read out some of the elements of that. So on Thursday the 19th of January at 9 p.m, I left Saudi Arabia and arrived via Emirates to London Heathrow on the 20th at 7:05. On that day later on, Friday the 20th, I delivered the sermon at Brixton, and then I met with the congregation after that. The following day, on the 21st, I met with the trustees for 2 hours between 12 and 2 p.m, followed by a meeting at 3 with the Shura. Later on that same day, between 5 and 8 p.m, I met with individual Shura colleagues to discuss general grievances, which some of them apparently had with me. The following day, we met again to discuss fundraising and building strategies with the necessary parties. And then I met later on with the school trustees, and that was followed by a meeting with Sisters of the Community. I went down to the University of Exeter the following day to meet my supervisor and course mentor. And then that same day in the afternoon, I scheduled to meet the lawyers for Zacarius Moussaoui for interviews in his defence. They were flying over to meet me for this. I'll elaborate upon that very shortly once we come to Zacarius Moussaoui's trial a few months later. Later that day as well, I had scheduled to meet some former sponsors and try and revive relationships with Yusuf Islam, who had been very supportive of the school's developments, Iqra Independent School. Then Tuesday, I met with other colleagues and I've got scheduled here a possible meeting with Abdurrahman Anderson to see the prison rehab project and how that was progressing. Wednesday, I was going to schedule and meet colleagues in Luton because our book, the only book that was published by Brixton Mosque, the Sabuni's book, Aqidat as-Salaf wa Ashab al-Hadith, in 1999, was going to be taken up by them, and we wanted to liaise over transferring that and financial issues in that regard. And then in the evening, I was to meet the trustees again and give feedback following my meeting with the Shura, and to review matters and changes that were implemented recently, and schedule my next action plan upon my return in March 2006. And then the following evening, Thursday, the 26th of January, I departed and returned to Jeddah. So that was what was taking place then. In the month of January, the mosque committee met and formed a conference committee to plan for our national event on the 3rd to the 5th of March. They agreed in those minutes that I'm looking at to meet fortnightly for a few weeks, 2nd and 8th of February, and then a final meeting on the 27th of Feb to make sure that everything was in place for that conference. On the 28th of January, I have a letter here, an invitation to attend the Wilton Park Conference, and as a keynote speaker, I hasten to add, and that was going to be dealing with a title called Towards a Community-Based Approach to Counterterrorism, and that was going to commence and take place on the 20th to the 22nd of March of that year. I was also asked to be part of a think tank's steering group, Demos, and they were doing research around this same issue of that conference, and their final publication was called Bringing It Home, Community-Based Approaches to Counter-Terrorism. My newly established initiative, which was an intervention one, focusing on vulnerable youth in the South London area, strategy to reach, empower and educate teenagers, Street, was referenced on page 75 of the final research delivered by Demos. And this particular report was one of the factors that led the Home Office towards contacting me with a view to applying for funding under the newly revamped Prevent Mark 1, as we call it now, initiative. And I won't go into that here because I've delivered a 2-part podcast called Inside Out of Prevent, and that's available for the listener if they want to know more about the specifics of the Prevent scheme and why Street worked with Prevent and then worked gradually to reduce that engagement from both sides, funding being lost and ourselves pulling back from the new legislation that made Prevent much more intrusive as a strategy. On the 13th of January, it's refreshing to note that Brixton, as a Salafi community, were involved and focusing on mental health issues. As we see of late that mental health is at the fore for the last 3-4 years. But at this time, in 2006, the mosque representatives met with the Maudsley Hospital staff to discuss training around helping community members with mental health issues. We moved to the 6th of March. Zacarius Moussaoui's trial began. And as I mentioned earlier, I was to act as his defense and character witness. And I'll explain why. When his lawyers approached me, I was surprised and actually taken aback because my immediate response was, but I've spoken against and opposed this individual. Their reply was that they tried to speak to friends of his and colleagues who refused to act as witnesses or proffer any type of defense for him. Such is the manner of the Takfiris in this instance, very vocal in wanting to uphold what they call are issues and values for the Ummah, But when it comes down to the microcosmic, simply defending an individual who shares your view, who shares your ideology, they're nowhere to be seen. I decided that I would be a defence witness and provide a character reference for him on the basis that it would avert the death penalty, because that was what the prosecution was seeking in the US. And also I wanted to thwart any attempt of Zacarius getting the death penalty and therefore thinking he was achieving martyrdom, because that would have only galvanized others to believe that he had been martyred at the hands of the great Satan, in inverted commas. His charges were conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism, transcending national boundaries. That was count 1. Count 2, conspiracy to commit aircraft piracy. Count 3, conspiracy to destroy aircraft. Count 4, conspiracy to use weapons of mass destruction. Count 5, conspiracy to murder United States employees. Count 6, conspiracy to destroy property of the United States. And on the 4th of May, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of release. And he's now serving that sentence in the same Supermax prison, I understand, as Richard Reed, aka the shoe bomber. Proceeding on. On the 23rd of March, I was honoured, I think, and humbled to receive an email request from a prominent author and public figure amongst the Muslim female community, in that she had recommended and urged me to consider working with her to put together an autobiography of my life, which as I said, I was humbled. It was an honour to be approached by a sister of this stature and standing, formerly from our community, and humbled because I didn't feel that my life warranted any sort of recounting, because there are many who've lived similar and more flamboyant lives than me. And she'd sent me a contract in that regard. However, months later, we did not proceed with that due to other events overtaking what she was doing and what I was doing. I will refer at this point to religious instruction, which I omitted in the previous episode due to the events that were unfolding at a rapid rate around terrorist attacks, the spotlight that was upon the Salafi community of Brixton and the Salafi communities up and down the UK. And so on the 14th of March, we embarked upon an intensive workshop and training program with the Jordanian sheikhs in Jordan. And the we that I refer to were management committee members, those of the newly established prison rehab organisation, and myself. I flew from Jeddah to meet them. They flew from London, and we embarked on a 4 or 5 day program up until the 18th of March. And this was prior to me travelling to Wilton Park for the conference that I mentioned the letter in a few moments ago. And I will highlight some of those lectures. Sheikh Ali Hassan delivered 3 sessions. Sheikh Mohammed Musa Nasser, rahimahullah, delivered 2 sessions. And Sheikh Salim Al-Hilali delivered 6 sessions. And they were on topics such as revolt, that was a 4-part session. Elections, a 1-part session. Levels of disbelief, 2 parts. Jihad and its levels, 3 parts. Dar al-Islam and its categories. Benefits from the incident of Ibn Abbas, and that was his meeting with the Khawarij. That was a 2-part session. And then Sheikh Salim delivered a lecture to us on the hadith pertaining to the Udul, the trustworthy, and the Ta'if al-Mansura, the aided group. So these were really intense, and I still have my notes here in front of me, which amounted to 65 pages. I still got them. I won't elaborate upon the content now, as this particular podcast is already protracted with the information that I commenced it with. The night before leaving Jordan, an interesting occurrence took place. I was scheduled, as I mentioned, to leave for London, the Wilton Park Conference, while my colleagues would remain behind to have a conclusive day with the Jordanian sheikhs. And that evening, I bumped into my mentor for my PhD. His name was Labi Siddiqui. And I was very surprised that he was all the way over in Jordan at the same time, in the same hotel as I was. And it made me somewhat suspicious, understandably so. But nevertheless, because the hotel was full and he was a bit upset that he couldn't get a room, he said it's his usual hotel when he's in Jordan, I thought I would score some brownie points, so to speak, and give up my room for him because I was leaving the next morning, and share in the twin room with one of my colleagues. When I travelled the next morning and arrived at the Wilton Park Conference, I saw my supervisor of the PhD, who was also in attendance, and he pulled me to the side and said he'd received a call from Labi that the secret police had visited the hotel seeking me. I asked had they made inquiries amongst my colleagues who were still present, and the answer was no. They only wanted me. So they actually came up to the room where he was because it had one more evening in my name, and they asked him to identify himself, and he confirmed that I had left the following morning. I'm highlighting this as a point of importance and a counter to the extremist, slanderous statements that continue to emanate that I and my colleagues were informers for security services, and before that, let's go back to the 1990s, that we were in the pockets of the Saudis and Saudi stooges and Saudi agents. And if that was the case, the securitized intensity that I faced in the UK and abroad would not have been taking place as it was. Proceeding now with the Wilton Park Conference feedback. I received a letter on the 24th of March, and I'm citing this to illustrate the importance of the wider engagement Salafis started to have societally on account of our experience and expertise in combating violent extremism. And the letter read as follows from Robin Hart, Ms. Robin Hart, the Associate Director of Wilton Park. Dear Abdul, thank you very much indeed for joining us for our conference at Wilton Park. It was excellent to have your contribution, both in the opening session and throughout the discussions, which added greatly to the rich discussions. You articulated extremely well some very thought-provoking issues, backed up by your huge experience. This was invaluable. And in the subsequent conference report received, in point 44, one of the observations among many was that, quote, Finsbury Park and Brixton mosques are examples of mosques now dealing with extremists head-on, in particular, challenging their propaganda. This needs experienced and knowledgeable people with a range of skills, close quote. So that wider engagement was gaining traction to such an extent that I received an official letter from the private secretary of MP Dominic Grieve on the 24th of May, which read as follows. Dear Sir, Dominic Grieve, the Shadow Attorney General, is also the Conservative spokesman on diversity and community cohesion. It has been suggested to him by Edward Garnier, MP, that a meeting with you would be most beneficial to both parties. Close quote from that excerpt. I'll move to yet more engagement widely, and it may be that I'm emphasizing this point, and I think it's important to do so, looking at post-conservative gains and them being the political party in government up until today, and that tidal shift in where Salafis then began to be viewed as non-violent extremists and as precursors to violent extremism and terrorism. So on the 8th of November, the leader of Lambeth, he visited Brixton Mosque and recounted that visit in his public diary entry. And he wrote, quote, together with external partners and community leaders, I was invited to the mosque by its chairman, Abdul Baker. I'd last been to the mosque in July last year after the London bombings. After those terrible events, a number of local civil and religious leaders came together on the steps of the mosque to reconfirm our commitment to a multi-faith community determined to remain strong and united in the face of terrorism. Close quote at this juncture. You'll recall my recent referencing to mosque management and ineffective leadership by them hiding, and I'll use that term, behind closed doors in the mosque while this visit from others within the Lambeth community took place to deal with and address the media that had converged on that occasion. Continuing with his diary entry, quote, I'd like to congratulate Abdul Haqq and his colleagues at Brixton Mosque for the work they're doing. Young people need positive things to do. They need strong role models to steer them in the right direction. The mosque's people have shown they want to work with the council and wider community to help give young people a better future. It's a great initiative and it deserves our support, close quote. And I'm going to draw to a conclusion and refer to some media events that we were involved in, myself in particular. And one specific one that comes to mind, and I have the feedback from that from media sources and normal observers, viewers who wrote into the mosque or expressed their views on the BBC website. And that was in Newsnight. I attended Newsnight alongside Maajid Nawaz, where we were interviewed and challenged by Kirsty Walk on the 10th of November 2006. And one of the feedback comes as follows, and I'll read it who it's from. Very interestingly, the title that this individual puts here in his message on their website is The Gay Jihadi, Here, Queer and Islamic, Get Used to It. But then he quotes many of our role models and heroes in Islam. He quotes Malcolm X, where he says, be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone, but if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. And that's his tagline. But he writes as follows, and I will read some excerpts of his observations of that interview with Kirsty Walk, myself, and Maajid Nawaz. Muslims refuse to play the media game. It is now common practice for the media to cause fitna and division within the Muslim ranks by trying to play two Muslims off against each other on air. Often, a so-called moderate is pitted against an extremist. The aim of this is to stifle any legitimate discussion and debate by trying to portray it as extremism or pandering to terrorism. This was the aim of Friday's BBC Newsnight, when they interviewed Maajid Nawaz, then of Hizb ut-Tahrir, and Abdul Baker, then chairman of Brixton Masjid. They were asked to comment on the latest Islamic scare story pushed by MI5 and Tony Blair of up to 30 UK terror plots in the making and the alleged radicalization of Muslim youth. It was clear at the outset that Newsnight's Kirsty Walk intended to paint HT as the bad guys and worked hard to cause disagreement between Nawaz and Haqq. But it was also clear that Nawaz and Haqq, to their credit, were wise enough not to fall for the trick. Instead, Walk ended up with egg on her face. And I'll give one final excerpt from this individual, where he states here, the interview is a textbook example of how Muslims should conduct themselves in the media. Unfortunately, we see too many examples of people who are falling over themselves to prove themselves as moderates and add to the Islamophobic narrative that all Muslims are a problem. Not only do they damage their own credibility in the process, but they make it incredibly difficult for others to articulate legitimate grievances without them being labelled as extremists in advance. It is time that Muslims stood up and argued their case without apology. We could do more with performances like we've seen on Newsnight. End of quote. I also received an email via the info at the mosque website. And it read this, it was forwarded to me from one of my colleagues. It read this, quote, I am a non-Muslim person, but I have followed the current debates with interest. I listened with interest to the chairman of your mosque, Abdul Baker, and I was astonished by what he said. It was a complete joy to hear a Muslim leader talking in ordinary language without any spite and a good deal of common sense. I was impressed by his ability to get to the heart of the issues in a sensible and coherent way. The BBC should take his opinions far more often, as he was a shining example of the voice of reason. I hope you will pass on my good wishes to Mr. Baker, and this was from a lady called Amanda Keynes from London SE7. And I'll make one final reference to correspondence received, actually posted to the mosque, from an individual whose name is Bill Wakely. And I'll refer to excerpts there as well. And he says on the 29th of November, "Dear Sir, I saw you on Newsnight 2 or 3 weeks ago and have been thinking about it a lot since then. I have wondered if it was as frustrating an experience for you and your Muslim co-interviewee as it was as a viewer. The hectoring and shallowness which Kirsty Walk brought into the occasion was regrettable. That event and a number of others in the media before and since give rise to a strong impression that the Muslim community in Britain is the focus of a great deal of unfair treatment and misrepresentation. This is neither new nor unique, of course. What is most significant, I cannot help feeling, is that the Muslim community seems to lack a focused response or voice to this dishonest tendency at a time when it perhaps is much needed. My reasons for writing to you are therefore, A, because I thought that you, as the representative of a London mosque of some standing, spoke reasonably and articulately in the face of some lamentably one-dimensional journalism, and B, because I hope that you might be able to give me a little of your time to discuss the matter in terms of how something could be organised to counterbalance the present drip feed of negative presentation of Muslims in the UK and in general." And I'll conclude with what he says at the end. He says, "As to myself, I am a mediator by trade and have lived and worked in a Muslim country, 4 years in Morocco, and elsewhere with a significant Muslim minority. I have some media contacts as well of relevance in that what I am talking about is an issue of media misrepresentation. I am not a Muslim," close quote. So these representations, these communications, by and large, by the wider society citizens, show that in Salafis engaging more widely, participating, and providing a more comprehensive narrative as to the social orthodoxy, but as well as that, participation as citizens in British society and life, meant that we were being more accepted. By being more accessible, our views and our practices were becoming more well known. And I think that is an element worth speaking about. The praise of me is not of myself, it is extended to the work that was being done amongst the Muslim communities, the Salafi communities in particular, on this occasion. And I'm going to conclude in finality now by listing some national events, but before doing so, particular mosque review that was given of Brixton Mosque. And this was an organisation or review called Salat-O-Matic, a review in 2006. And so it refers to the Brixton Mosque, and its description was the mosque serves a mainly West Indian community of reverts to Islam, although there are many Muslims who attend this mosque from a wide variety of backgrounds. Then it gives our denomination, Sunni, Salafi, demographics, multicultural. All the daily prayers are offered, including Jummah. There's a women's area, and the restrooms are clean, and there's no children's area as such. Disabled access, yes. The language of the Friday khutbah is in English. Then it mentions the leadership, Imam Umar Jamaiki as Imam, Director, President, Abdul Haqq Baker, type of governance, permanent trustees. Women in leadership, unknown. And this contributor mentions here, Assalamu alaikum. I recently had a chance to pray Maghrib in this masjid. MashaAllah, the women's section is lovely with a new kitchen and wudu, ablution area, and is accessible at all times. My husband has prayed there a few times and finds the place very friendly as well as good for visiting with children, as the brothers are friendly and understanding. They have posters inside the masjid advertising their small bookshop and tailoring services, and a wide range of people do attend. When I attended, it was mainly Somali sisters with one Italian revert sister. Also, a lot of Caucasian reverts attend as well, and not all of them are Salafi. Submitted by Abdullah 81 on November the 21st, 2006. Again, showing from an internal perspective what a visitor would see who is not a member to the mosque, or an adherent of Salafism. National and international events. On the 30th of March, the UK Terrorism Act 2006 became law. On the 26th of May of that year, the Java earthquake killed 5,700 people, leaving 200,000 homeless. On the 7th of June, the Houses of Parliament temporarily closed due to an anthrax alert. And on the 29th of June, we see in America the case of Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. And that is where the US Supreme Court ruled that President George W. Bush's plan to try Guantanamo Bay detainees in military tribunals violated US and international law. And my final comment for this particular year was in review of events that took place on the 5th of November, where Saddam Hussein was sentenced to death for the role in the massacre of 148 Shia members in 1982. And it's interesting that that is for which Saddam Hussein was executed, and it was facilitated by the West. But we all know, in reality, his crime was standing up to them on this occasion and their woeful failure to find weapons of mass destruction. So they had to refer it to an internal event, and that was the factionalism between the Shia, the Sunnis, the Ba'athist party, and we only have to look today to see the state of affairs in Iraq.